God, things that lift us up, things that get us excited, and things that make it hard to see how we could ever get excited. Father, I pray that in each of those situations, God, that we would see you at work. God, where we are unable to act, to change things, God, we would be at peace knowing that you are at work and that you are good. So, Father, may you lift us up this morning. May you encourage us. May we find joy and hope and peace in you. And may we continue to bring what is on our hearts to you, knowing that you care. Pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, I want to ask you, so I'm going to. Last week, how many emotions did you have? All of them. All of them. How many emotions did you have last week? Some of you, said all of them. Like it was just an emotional week last week. Maybe you're sitting here thinking, I had two. Tired and not tired. Maybe you had a great week. You're thinking, I was pretty happy the whole week. It's kind of a weird question. How many emotions did you have last week? And maybe a better question would be, how emotional do you consider yourself? How emotional do you consider yourself? See, we all have emotions. Some of us might feel more emotional, and some of us might feel more, you know what, I don't feel as emotional as some people I encounter. You know, I've gone through many different emotions in my life, as I'm sure you have. Times of elation and times of depression. Times I've felt apathetic or passionate, happy or sad. Times when I felt excluded or welcomed, loved or hated. There have been times when I have felt like emotions are all that I have, where they're just oozing out of every part of my body. And other times when it feels like I can't remember what feeling feels like. And yet we are emotional beings. Our feelings bring us together. They help us to have deeper connections with each other. Sometimes our emotions separate us. Our emotions sometimes help us to enjoy our lives. If we didn't have emotions, if we didn't feel, it'd just almost be like robots. Our emotions can drive us to act, and they can also prevent us from making decisions, good or bad. And while we always have them, I tend to find that my emotions heighten around Christmas time. And maybe you're like me. Maybe you find that Christmas time is an emotional season. Just last Sunday, I'm got to be honest, I was crying a little bit watching the movie Klaus, an animated Christmas movie about a comically divided community that finds healing in spite of their selfishness. And they find healing in the selflessness of one of the main characters. In spite of the selfishness of the main character, who's a mailman or a postman, And they find it through the generosity of an out-of-town woodworker. And Christmas brings up, for me, all sorts of emotions. And I'm sure for you, memories of past years may stir up sadness, may stir up joy, peace, disappointment. Maybe everything and more. As the lights cover our house and the lawn decorations inflate around town, as the presents are purchased, as plans are made, the coming of Christmas can bring waves of emotions that are both positive and maybe not so positive. Feelings that we welcome and those that we wish we could just ignore. And it was into our emotional world that Jesus decided to enter. And you might be thinking, well, it's a little too early to start a series on Christmas. Well, we're going to start a series on the emotions of Christmas. And there's a lot of emotions to go through. And I'm not going to be able to hit every one. But we're going to go over some of the emotions that we experience at Christmas. And some of the emotions that were present in that first Christmas. See, as Jesus entered this world, people were involved. And people are emotional beings. And whether you've heard the Christmas story, you're hearing it maybe for the first time, or you've heard it 100 times and more, sometimes we forget that the people we read about in the story are not too different from us. Though we have different technologies, we still have similar emotions. We see in these people emotions that move them to act, to sing, emotions that bring about evil, and emotions of terrible grief. Emotions of excitement and awe and wonder. And whatever plans you have in store this Christmas, we are going to look at the emotions that we will experience, that we have experienced in light of the Christmas story. Now, what might surprise you and maybe even sadden you, sometimes we can just want the good emotions. Let's focus on the good emotions. This week we're actually going to start with an emotion that is not too often tied with Christmas. An emotion that we might wish to get rid of. We're going to talk about anger. Anger. When you think of Christmas, do you think about anger? I hope not. But if you do, there's hope. While you may not think of Christmas as an angry time of year, I'm sure that there have been different times during the Christmas season where we have been angry, even just a little bit. And with the excitement of angels and proclamation of good news and miracles, in the middle of the arrival of the Savior of the world, we see anger as part of the story. Now, both Matthew and Luke record the events surrounding Jesus' birth, and each of them kind of filling in different pieces of the story, different perspectives of the same story. And this week we're going to look at mainly Matthew's account. And we're going to start in Matthew chapter 2. We're actually going to start after the main event. And kind of weird to maybe, you're probably not thinking like, let's get to Boxing Day. But that's kind of what we're going to do. We're going to look at the story that happens after Jesus' birth and how anger plays a very significant role. The first person we're going to look at is Herod. And we're going to read Matthew chapter 2, verses 1-8. After Jesus was born in Bethlehem, in Judea, during the time of King Herod, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem and asked, "Where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? We saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him." When King Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. When he had called together all the people's chief priests and teachers of the law, he asked them where the Messiah was to be born. "In Bethlehem, in Judea," they replied, "for this is what the prophet has written. But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For out of you will come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel." Then Herod called the Magi secretly and found out from them the exact time the star had appeared. He sent them to Bethlehem and said, "Go and search carefully for the child. As soon as you find him, report to me so that I too may go and worship him." The first person that we see, that we'll look at their anger, is King Herod, also known as Herod the Great. Now, Herod was in charge of Judea. He was chosen to be the king of that area and reigned at the time of Jesus' birth. The governmental structure of Rome was somewhat complex, but he was kind of a king under Roman rule. So Rome essentially said, you can be king. We'll empower you as long as you ensure taxes and keep things peaceful, and we're okay with you being king of this area. Now, Herod was renowned for his passion of architecture. Actually, he was a king that loved having things built and renewed. He commissioned a citadel in honor of himself, and it was called the Herodium. Humility was not really part of Herod's nature. Named this beautiful place after himself. He also had a mountain fortress called Masada built, which has a unique place in history. And it was this incredible fortress that was extremely well built. And most notable to the Jewish people of his day was that Herod had commissioned a renovation project for the temple in Jerusalem. See, one of the ways that Herod maintained control was to kind of appease people, or kind of allow them to do their thing, and he commissioned this temple, the renovation of the temple, not because he was Jewish or followed the laws, but because he cared about architecture and figured, hey, this will make them happy and keep me in power and happy with Rome. And while you might be tempted to think that Herod's generosity to the Jewish people and their temple makes him someone of admiration, Herod was an incredibly paranoid and evil man. His lust for power was well known, and it led him to kill even his own family. According to Jewish historian Josephus, after having her parents killed, Herod eventually had his supposed favorite of 10 wives executed. Thinking that his sons at one point were trying to take his throne, he also had them killed. See, Josephus, this Jewish historian, in his work called Jewish War, we read this. He also sent his sons to Sebast, a city not far from Caesarea, and ordered them to be there strangled. And this was the end of Alexander and Aristobulus. Herod was focused on himself, maintaining his position, his power, and he didn't care about other people that stood in his way, even his own family. It would have come as no surprise to people of Matthew's day as he wrote about King Herod, saying that he was disturbed when he heard this news, that a king of the Jews had been born. In fact, it would have made sense that all of Jerusalem would have been disturbed with him, not because necessarily that they were worried about this new king, but they were worried about Herod's response. What was this violent king, this evil king, going to do? To what lengths would he go to maintain his power? See, the words that the Magi brought hope and excitement. We read them now and we think, imagine what it would be like to have been there and these wise men from the east come and say, we have heard about this king being born. Something you, as if you were Jewish, you would have been waiting for your entire life. Your grandfather, your great-grandfather would have been waiting for. To hear this news would have been exciting. And yet, because of one man's anger, it turns to a moment of apprehension and anxiety. See, of course, Herod had no interest in worshiping this new king. To the wise men, ignorant of the king's true character, his request seemed reasonable. I mean, that's what they were there to do. Why wouldn't more join us? Yet to those who knew Herod, they knew Herod was focused on the fact that he was king of the Jews. Herod was king. And anyone that was going to challenge that would face his wrath. Now, alerted to this threat of power, it only made sense to Herod that he would use these wise men and use them to unwittingly help him maintain his throne. And yet, in spite of Herod's intentions, we can be encouraged that God was at work. His plan would not go foiled, no matter which ruler had their plans. See, before the Magi went back to Herod, before the wise men went back, God intervened. We read in Matthew 2, verse 12, and having been warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they returned to their country by another route. God made a way for there to be more time for Mary and Joseph and Jesus to escape. God always makes a way for his plan to succeed. But after Herod did not hear back from them, he could have. He could have had a moment of anger at being slighted. He gave people instructions to act, to come back to him. He was the king of the area. You follow the king's orders. They didn't follow me. He could have had a moment where he was angry and just, okay, whatever, moving on with life. He could have shrugged it off and gone back to his construction projects and continued enjoying the power that he had. And yet the anger which arose in Herod, left unharnessed and fueled by total selfishness, drove him to command an absolute terrible tragedy. And Matthew records this. Chapter 2, verse 16. When Herod realized that he had been outwitted by the Magi, he was furious. And he gave orders to kill all the boys in Bethlehem and its vicinity who were 2 years old and under, in accordance with the time he had learned from the Magi. Sometimes we gloss over this part of the story. At Christmas, we avoid this part of the story because it doesn't bring us the Christmas feelings that we want, that we expect. And yet, anger was very much a part of the story. This terrible circumstance, this terrible event happened. And we see that Herod's anger left unchecked. His self-centered anger brought death. It's why John wrote in his letter, 1 John chapter 3, verse 15, anyone who hates a brother or sister is a murderer. And you know that no murderer has eternal life residing in him. Anger that festers and continues out of selfish desires leads to death. When we get angry at others, when we start to hate others, we begin to feed into that anger that Herod had. See, when anger shows up, we need to be absolutely careful at what we allow to grow in our hearts and what we decide to do. Will we decide the path of death, or will we choose a different way? Now, please don't think that all anger, or the source of all anger, is wrong. But anger, when paired with our selfish desires, leads to death. The next person we're going to look at is Joseph. Now, we don't actually read of Joseph getting angry. And so this is a bit of a hypothesis. But if I had been in Joseph's position, I'm sure I would have been angry along with many other things. See, when Joseph and Mary were what we would maybe look at as being engaged, kind of when Mary, his betrothed, it was a bit like a fiance today, but it was actually more legally binding than a fiance today. When Mary approached him before they had gotten married, he was given an opportunity for anger to take root. We read in Matthew chapter 1, verse 18. This is how the birth of Jesus the Messiah came about. His mother Mary was pledged to be married to Joseph, but before they came together, she was found to be pregnant through the Holy Spirit. Excuse me. Now, the wedding date was planned. The house was being prepared. Maybe the honeymoon tickets were purchased. And all of a sudden, the wife comes and tells the husband, or the wife-to-be tells the husband-to-be that she's pregnant and he's not the father. See, as scandalous as this would be today, it was even more so in Joseph and Mary's day. Mary, of course, was telling the truth. But Joseph hadn't been there. And in Joseph's shoes, could we really expect to listen to Mary's story and think, oh yeah, that makes total sense? I put myself in Joseph's shoes and think, why are you, do you think I'm a fool? That I would believe this story to cover up your evil deed? The way you've dishonored me and you just thrown away the love? Well, how dumb do you think I am? Not only would it probably have felt like Mary betrayed him, but she now treats him as a fool. How could Mary do this? How could she betray him like this? You know the thoughts that go on in your mind when someone does something against you. Could you imagine the thoughts that were reverberating around Joseph's mind? And while we don't read of Joseph getting angry, and I truly cannot say that he was, I do find it hard to believe that anger would not have been there. And yet, with whatever Joseph was feeling, this was his response in the very next verse. Because Joseph, her husband, was faithful to the law, and yet did not want to expose her to public disgrace, he had in mind to divorce her quietly. See, we know Joseph wasn't buying her story. We know that he wasn't as excited as Mary was. And he could have allowed anger to take root, which, if he was angry, it only makes sense. That is an anger when something wrong has happened. It's good to have a bit of anger when right is slighted, when there is wrong done. But Joseph could have allowed his selfishness to come in, and he could have told everyone about her unfaithfulness, not to mention possible blasphemy. Did you hear this story that Mary told me? Instead, we read that he was faithful to the law and wanted to preserve whatever dignity Mary had left. See, perhaps Joseph had in mind Leviticus 19, verse 17. Do not hate a fellow Israelite in your heart. Rebuke your neighbor frankly so you will not share in their guilt. See, he could have hated Mary. He could have let that feeling control him. And yet, Joseph's reaction is almost the exact opposite of Herod's. Herod would have had her killed, probably. Joseph offered her grace. If Joseph had been angry, he didn't let it control him. He did not react with complete selfish anger. Joseph submitted whatever feelings he had to God, which paved the way for God to speak to him. See, Joseph's possible anger, Joseph's feelings brought submission. He left room for God to work, not against him, but to bring about what this world needed. See, we see God act against what Herod's desires were. But Joseph, by going about it the way he did, allows God to work with him. When you get angry, do you submit it to God? I know that's hard. When you get angry, do you work in a way that God now has to work against you to bring about goodness? Or do you allow him to work with you? So far, the angers that we have seen have come from people. And again, I want to reiterate, not all anger is evil. Should we always be ashamed of when we are angry? Why would we then have anger in the first place? Well, it probably doesn't come as a surprise to you that God himself got angry. Moses actually records God's anger against himself in Exodus. Moses wrote of God getting angry at him. In Exodus 4, verses 13 to 14, we read, "But Moses said, 'Pardon your servant, Lord. Please send someone else.' Then the Lord's anger burned against Moses, and he said, 'What about your brother Aaron the Levite? I know he can speak well. He is already on his way to meet you, and he will be glad to see you.'" Now, in these two verses, we could look at that and think, well, Moses is asking politely, what's God getting angry about? And yet, God has just finished showing Moses miraculous signs as Moses continues to push back against God's request. God has shown Moses, I can do anything. You're good. Just go. And yet Moses still says, somebody else. God is not angry over Moses' offense. God isn't angry because he's offended by Moses. Let me make that clear. He's not like, Moses, come, like, that's not what God is worried about. He's angry because Moses' selfishness is becoming a barrier, preventing others from receiving God's deliverance. Moses, I have this plan in store. I need you to go for their sake. See, when Jesus was in the local synagogue and saw a man in need, Jesus got angry. When Mark wrote of Jesus' life, we read in Mark 3, verses 4 to 5, "Then Jesus asked them, which is lawful on the Sabbath, to do good or to do evil, to save a life or to kill?" But they remained silent. He looked around at them in anger and deeply distressed at their stubborn hearts, said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He stretched it out, and his hand was completely restored. Again, we see the anger of God expressed. Not an anger out of a desire for payback, as we would see it, but angry that stubborn hearts of religious leaders that were meant to represent God, to connect people with God, were actually a detriment to those in their care. In Nahum, we read of God's character in part. Nahum chapter 1, verse 2. "The Lord is a jealous and avenging God. The Lord takes vengeance and is filled with wrath. The Lord takes vengeance on his foes and vents his wrath against his enemies." Now this is a challenging picture of God. And we see this because we see it in part of how humans have so poorly expressed their anger. And so we filter our understanding of God through that. But God is not like us. And we need to keep reading. We read on in the next verse, Nahum 1, verse 3. "The Lord is slow to anger, but great in power. The Lord will not leave the guilty unpunished. His way is in the whirlwind and the storm, and the clouds are the dust of his feet." God is not a ball of anger, ready to, as Herod, destroy anyone who opposes his power. God's anger and Herod's anger are quite the opposite. Herod's anger brings death. But God's anger towards is towards death. God's anger is towards death and all that which prevents his creation from being what it was created to be. It's not selfish anger. It's selfless anger. God is concerned for his creation. And we need to be very careful that we don't think that our anger is equal to God's anger. Sometimes we have these angry feelings that we say is we have righteous anger. It's just anger. And yes, we can get angry at things that are wrong. But there's always that temptation for our humanness, our brokenness to intermix with that anger and lead us to act or say things that go against God's desires. God's anger is incorruptible. Our anger is not. God's anger always comes out of his love for his creation and his desire for things to be right and made right. As the psalmist put it in Psalms 7 verse 11, God is a righteous judge, a God who displays his wrath every day. God's anger for the damage that sinful hearts wreak on his good creation, it flows into his desire for redemption, to make a way for restoration. Evil needs to be condemned so that goodness and rightness can be restored. See, Jesus' birth is one of the most powerful moments in all of time, in all of history. And it would lead the way to a moment in time where Jesus would give up his life so that we could experience life and freedom. Jesus would grow up and the people he came to restore would kill him. And in that moment, do you not think that would be the time where God would be most angry? Where Jesus was here to bring life, to bring healing. Where Jesus had already been speaking words of truth and performing miracle after miracle. And yet his disciples desert him, and the very people he came to save had him killed. From disciples to the people that he chose to be a blessing to the nations, to the government that was in control. See, God's anger would have been very evident would have been very big at this moment. Yet it wasn't the selfish anger that Herod had. Because if it had been, everyone would have died. But instead, it was Jesus who died. So that the love from which God's pure anger had come could be fully revealed. See, our anger left on its own brings about death, but God's anger brings justice and restoration. The music team can come back up as we close. This Christmas, maybe even this week, when things go awry, when maybe the gift you had planned to get is sold out, when things break down and eat into your Christmas budget, when it feels like everything is going wrong, when someone says something that gets under your skin, or do things that infuriate you, what will you do? Will you, like Herod, look for ways to preserve yourself your position and what you think is right. I'm not thinking that you're going to go kill people. But we can act in a similar way where we allow our selfishness to control how we act in that anger. Or will we be like Joseph, with whatever we're feeling, submit to God to ensure that our human desires for revenge are left unfulfilled and that God has a chance to speak and to work through us, not in spite of us. See, if Joseph had gone about the same news that Herod received, see, they both got the same news, different situations. But if Joseph had gone about the same news in the way Herod had, with what power he had, he would not have given God the opportunity to speak to him in a dream. If Joseph had allowed human anger to dominate his heart, he would have missed the product of God's anger, which flows from his love. He would have missed God's greatest gift. He would have missed being a part of that. How often do you and I allow our anger to control how we act so that we miss out on God's goodness? How often do we let our anger mix with our selfishness to then control our words and our actions? This is in part why Paul wrote to the Christians in Ephesus in Ephesians chapter 4, verses 26 to 27. He says, "In your anger, do not sin. Do not let the sun go down while you are still angry, and do not give the devil a foothold." When you sense yourself getting angry, don't sin. Maybe try not to respond right away. Don't give the devil, the one who wants to accuse you and make you feel guilty and ashamed, don't give him something to throw at you. Take it to God. Let him speak to you. Let him speak through you. Take it to Jesus and see how his anger came out in a way that sought restoration. When you are angry, look to God. As we sing, I want us to take some time to ask God for forgiveness where we have acted with selfish hearts in our anger. Where we have allowed our corrupt anger to come out in this world. And then let us look forward to see how God will bring about his incredible plan as you let him help you with your anger. So let's sing and